Let's assume that act-utilitarianism is the correct normative theory regarding ethics, and pontificate on its practical implementation in the real world. Specifically, if one knew without a doubt that what he ought to do was maximizing overall happiness, would he have a need for norms and laws? Shouldn't one just aim at teaching the consequentialist theory to everyone, and dispense of all the other rules? At the end of the day, for an act-utilitarian, if everyone behaved in a way that maximized without prejudice the overall happiness of humanity, there wouldn't seem to be much need for states, borders, and laws. One could be tempted to think that all this extra structure would be superfluous. In reality, we claim there are some issues to face. In this video we will show why rules and laws may not only be compatible with a simple act-consequentialist theory, but may also be naturally derived from it. There is some theoretical importance in establishing this fact. Consequentialists may talk about the utility societal rules can produce, implicitly acknowledging their importance and their existence. Being more explicit on how they arise makes the application of the theory clearer. In addition, in the field of moral philosophy, there is an age-old tension between the two most renowned approaches to ethics, deontology and consequentialism. A deontological moral theory is one that informs individuals on what acts are good or bad based on a series of rules. Rules comprise the moral theory. Instead, a consequentialist moral theory, like utilitarianism, decides if an action is good or bad based on its foreseeable consequences. A wet dream of many moral philosophers is to combine the two theories into a coherent model that retains the advantages of both frameworks. Theories like rule utilitarianism, threshold deontology, and two-level utilitarianism are attempts to do just that. These theories start from one of the two main approaches and incorporate the other directly into the moral theory. They expand upon a model's framework to capture both schools of thought. An act-consequentialist may also aim to release the tension between deontological and consequentialist thinking, but without incorporating rules and norms directly into the theoretical framework. Rather, one may claim that they are needed in practice to maximize happiness. According to this reasoning, then, it's the interplay of a theory with a practice that gives rise to the use of norms and laws. Let's see some possible motivations for this way of thinking. Firstly, suppose we lived in a world without rules, armed with the only knowledge that we ought to maximize everybody's happiness. There are situations in which rules would arise naturally, like in the case where multiple people wanted to buy an ice cream. In this setting, a norm where on the basis of the order of arrival, people should line up for their cone, solves the problem of understanding who got there first. Instituting this norm has the consequence of increasing happiness. Obeying it helps the norm survive and provides well-being. If one was only naively armed with the principle of utility, he would go around acquiring information on who has the highest levels of hunger, to then give them the ice cream first. And in such an ordinary setting, these efforts would bring more annoyances than anything else. The lining up rule efficiently aids us in maximizing happiness. Norms would also be produced organically in situations where there is an asymmetry of information between people. For instance, an act-consequentialist electrician would still label any machinery that could produce some health hazard with a high voltage warning, suggesting other individuals to stay at a minimum distance. Laymen would then abide by this norm since they would understand it's in their best interests. Again, such a rule would be created by putting the utility principle in practice. Second, when we apply moral theory in practice, we have to account for the fact that not everyone cares about morality, not everyone has the time to understand a moral theory, and not everyone can estimate the foreseeable consequences of actions with decent success. Many humans are too preoccupied with survival or other stuff to actually ponder on such matters. And some people can't be trusted with the utility principle alone. Rules leverage the fact that we are creatures of habit, so they get transmitted effortlessly through generations and cultures. They simplify the infinite possibilities on how to act in a given setting, left open by the principle of utility, and they provide very useful heuristics to everyone. They are easy to teach, learn, and put in practice. Rules are simple enough for our Pavlovian mechanisms to kick in, so that in the overwhelming majority of cases they become second nature, guiding most people to naturally perform good actions, while the principle of utility alone entails too many possibilities to actually form a habit-inducing mechanism. Third, the utility principle alone is prone to be applied in an erroneous manner. As humans, we are self-centered and subject to a host of biases. Rules can harness our tendency to conform to make us behave less selfishly. Our inclination to fit in then can, in some cases, make us behave in a more cooperative manner with other individuals. As before, rules leverage some of our tendencies to remedy the bad outcomes that other biases would produce if left only with a utility principle. In this case, our need to conform with the norms other members of society follow limits the scope of the self-serving actions we might be willing to make if the norms weren't there. Finally, norms usually have an associated punishment if one does not obey them. The punishment is useful because in practice we know that it's not always easy to act morally, so the punishment functions as an extra deterrent for individuals who are thinking on doing something bad, and in theory as a rehabilitation mechanism to get one back on the right track. We could go on. With this list we don't mean to be exhaustive, merely show how rules can be accounted for in a consequentialist setting without including them directly in the moral theory. The bottom line is that eliminating all rules to leave everybody with only the utility principle would not actually increase overall well-being. It would likely be a disaster. Thus, rules can be seen as a useful applied instrument for an act-consequentialist theory. Furthermore, abiding by a rule, perpetuating its existence, is often the best action a utilitarian can perform in a given setting. Thus, in many cases, rules ought to be followed according to the act-consequentialist theory itself. And creating a rule that, if followed, would increase overall happiness is another positive utility action. This type of deontological thinking can be very much appreciated by a consequentialist. All this goes to show that the interaction between our conduct and norms should feature prominently in our considerations when thinking about the morality of actions. Note that excluding rules from the moral theory, viewing them as derived from it, does not mean that they are of secondary importance. They dominate the practical applications of the theory, where one could argue for most individuals they become paradoxically more useful than the principle of utility itself. For us, the deontological approach to morality is reconciled with the consequentialist one under these terms. Following this paradigm, one could also view deontological religious norms as an ancient practical implementation of utilitarianism. That would make a brilliant love story between the two major moral theories, full of sexual tension and twists. With these exuberant speculations we conclude. Lots of eudaimonia to all.